So we are here at the Center for Educational Technology, Institute of Education, University of Tartu in Estonia. We have here an installation dedicated to education futures in time, which we prepared for the opening of the new academic year at our university. So what is the main purpose of this? The main purpose of this is to show how educational technology and educational technologies are not just tools, but they also constitute some sort of prism through which we imagine how education should be in the future. And what we do with this installation is to see how education futures are imagined and envisioned throughout time. We have actually used the table where we usually have our center meeting, and we divided the table up into three parts. We have education futures of the past year, then we move on to education futures in the present, and then the last part is about future in the becoming. So the first part of the table is dedicated to education futures of the past. The main idea with this section is to show to people that education futures has a long history, which means that people in the past actually imagined or thought of how the futures of education might be. Futures for them, but in some cases past or present for us. In this case, what we did was to collect some of these images of how people imagine the education, the futures of education in the past. In some cases, we actually have literally artworks. For example, we have this one, which is by a French artist called Villermart. I think that it's pronounced this way. He had a series of drawings in which he imagined society in the year 2000, which is past for us, but future for him, because he made those drawings in 1910. Then we have other images or visions of the futures, of education futures involved the emerging technologies of the day. So we have the radio book, then we have the educational television. We also have how people imagine cinema could help learning and education. Then we have something from the 50s, which was published in the Sunday comic, Closer Than We Think, when they imagined the so-called push-button education. On the other side of the table, we have other more recent images of education future. So we have two images or two visions from the 60s involving basically what we would now refer to as AI tools, auto-tutor, and the answer machine, which is quite similar, I would say, to a chatbot. And then we have the most recent one from the 80s, which represents how people imagine homework in the future, again, with the tutoring system. At the same time, we also put some questions to make people think. So what visions did people from the past entertain? So how they actually imagine the future of education. Then what technologies did they use to depict the future? That's another question. And of course, we also invite them to think about the similarities and differences with the present time. We also added a reference to Estonia, to the history of Estonian education futures, which is from the 90s. This is the famous Tiger Leap. Tigrihüpe means Tiger Leap in Estonia. And it was a program launched by the president of Estonia of the time. And it was supposed to bring computers and connectivity to every school in Estonia. Every Estonian knows about this program. And this is to show that education futures are not just the more speculative futures, but they're also related to the actual programs that we run to change education. Now we move to education futures in the present. So we're now talking about how we imagine the futures of education in the present time. Here again, we have on the table some elements describing how we approach education futures in the present. Here we have some images that were retrieved from Adobe Stock. These are what they are called stock images. So stock images are a particular kind of pictures because they're highly stereotyped. These are pictures that are meant to be used and reused in different contexts. So by definition, stock photos or stock images should represent something that, as I said, stereotypical, something that is readily accessible, that people can easily understand. And through stock photos, we can actually see some of the images that are more dominant in the present when we think of the future of. So as you can see here, these are all very stereotypical images of how the future of education is represented. So we have VR goggles here and here. So the creators imagine that in the future, students will be using VR goggles to learn. But we also have, obviously, computers here. In some cases, we have a traditional classroom. In others, we have learners who appear to be alone in the classroom. We indeed have AI in this picture with a virtual tutor. We also put some questions for the people to reflect on these stock photos. For example, we ask what are these dominant imaginaries, dominant visions of education futures? Who is actually producing them? Who are the losers and the winners in this game? And of course, the last question is whether we want these futures to be realized. On the other side, we go back to Estonia, what is happening in Estonia in the present time, because we are dealing with education futures in the present. In this case, we have material about the Expo 2020, which actually took place in Dubai in 2021, where Estonia had a stand. But more importantly, we also have a reference to the new Tiger Leap 2.0, which is dedicated to AI. It's called AI Leap, which is supposed to introduce responsible AI in grade 10 and 11. In this case, we have some quotes from the initiators, chiefly the president, the current president of Estonia. We also have the description of this vision of the future, because the AI leap is actually a vision of the future. And we also added a counterpoint, a critical voice, just to show that education futures in the present are not monolithic. Often they are negotiated and they are actually discussed in the public arena. Here we're still discussing education futures in the present. In this part, we have collected some of the myths in education. These are actually from a book that was published in the 70s with some very nice looking drawings about essentially the myths that we should actually bust that concerns the way people should be learning and teaching. We're still here discussing education futures in the present, but from a slightly different perspective. Here we have collected some of the myths that we have in education. These drawings are actually taken from a book published in the 70s, which is called Myths in Education. And this was to show that very often the visions of education futures become myths. In other words, they are reproduced and we keep reproducing them when probably we should actually teach them. We should actually bust those myths. These are some examples: the myth of the right method, the behavioral objectives myth, the myth that competition is a great motivator. And what is interesting is that some of these myths are actually traveling across time, and we find them again and again. On that side, we have something different because we go back again to Estonia. This is a cover that came out when Expo 2020 took place. And it's basically the representation of what we would call post-digital, what would describe a post-digital nation. Probably Estonia is a post-digital nation, when basically technology has become, let's say, a second language. So the digital is no longer a novelty, but it's something that has been fully incorporated in society as well as in education. And last but not least, we have also recorded a video of a dialogue with GPT-5. The dialogue is called In Search of the Future Classroom, which is a dialogue or a conversation that we have with ChatGPT in order to create a vision of the future classroom. What is interesting is that you will see that the dialogue did not end well. Now we have come to the last part of the exhibition, which is about future in the becoming. This is probably the most metaphysical, the most philosophical one, because it's about something that is fully unknown. So we have actually seen how people from the past imagine the future. Then we moved on to how we imagine the future in the present. And now we are here describing what the future really is. Well, what the future really is that it's unknown. Nobody knows how the future will be. So this part was rather challenging because we had to somehow represent something that is not yet here, something that does not yet have an image. And in this case, we decided to use number one, two poems, which are in Estonian. One poem is about history and the future. Another poem is about becoming. And then we added elements like Lego and Play-Doh, which are symbolizing the fact that we're still constructing the future. So we don't have a clear image of the future because it's still in the becoming. Then we also added a tiger that is crossing the space between present and future. And we added two books. One is The Beautiful Risk of Education, that symbolizes that we're dealing with uncertainty, something that is not yet there. And also James Bridle's book on ways of being, because our interpretation of the future in the becoming is that we need to dwell with possibility and be open to alternatives, even to something that we can't quite imagine yet. And last but not least, we go back to the topic of post-digital. We have here an old computer that has been teared down with a question on the dead screen: have we become post-digital? And to complete the installation, we have two screens facing each other, opposite to each other. On this screen, we have a couple of documentaries, again, about education futures in the past. So we basically have a BBC documentary shot in the 60s about the introduction of computers to school. Then we have a footage from launching the Tiger Leap in Estonia back in the 90s. And we also have a very famous documentary made in 1967 in which they imagine society as well as education in the year 1999. And on this side, we have a projector projecting onto this canvas where there is almost like a visual poem representing how, in the end, futures is actually constructed together by us. And this is basically completing the whole installation.
Librarian, banker, teacher, medical technician, bridge partner, and all-around servant in this house of tomorrow.